In this episode of Idea City,
bees are sexual go-betweens for flowers. Flying penises, one researcher put it. And so their job is to move pollen from the ripe anthers of one flower to the receptive stigma of another flower, thereby achieving fertilization. So that little jolt of possibility when the pollen grain hits the stigma produces a jolt of energy that runs whole ecosystems. It's not just us who are being fed by pollination. It's the whole living world in terrestrial ecosystems.
It was about 2006 when I first began to read about the shocking decline of honeybees and other pollinators, particularly in North America. And I first saw this in juxtaposition with a quote from Albert Einstein in which he was purported to have said that as go the bees, so go we. And then, a couple years later, I began to read that the quote was bogus and that honey production was way up despite what was being called colony collapse disorder. So there's a mystery there, and I thought, how do we get to the bottom of this thing? This is Candace.
The chiefest cause to read good books that moves each studious mind is hope, some pleasure sweet therein, or profit good to find. And what delight could greater be than secrets for to know of sacred bees, the muses' birds, all which this book doth show. And if commodity thou crave, learn here no little game of their most sweet and sovereign gifts with no great cost or pain. If pleasure then or profit may to read induce thy mind, in this small treatise, choice of both, good reader, thou shalt find. Now, you will already have detected that I didn't write those words. They were actually penned by an eccentric English clergyman and beekeeper, lexicographer, the kind of person who, if Idea City were celebrating its 400th anniversary rather than its 10th, would have been on this stage. His name was Charles Butler, and he wrote those words as the epigraph to a book called The Feminine Monarchy, a treatise concerning bees and the divine ordering thereof. And what delight could greater be than secrets for to know of sacred bees? I began to be fascinated by bees when I was one of those laughing babies. I was about this tall, and I think it might be actually my first autonomous memory. I remember being away from the house all by myself in a big lawn with big fields all around. And on my arm, there was the most beautiful creature I had ever seen in my life. I did not know in all the world there could be anything so beautiful as this black and yellow, shining, six-legged wonder on my arm. It's getting to be a long time ago, and I can't actually inhabit that memory anymore, but I still have a sense of the kind of light of wonder that filled my whole small body in that moment. And then, of course, it stung me, and I was destined to remember it for the rest of my life. About 100 million years ago, the first bee it was really a wasp that became adapted to feed in flowers. And so bees are exclusively herbivores. They come equipped, all of them, with long extensible tongues for sucking nectar out of flowers. And their signature characteristic are the little branched hairs that they have on some or all of their bodies, on parts of their bodies. So they're completely flower-fixated wasps, is what a bee is. Bees are sexual go-betweens for flowers. Flying penises, one researcher put it. And so their job is to move pollen from the ripe anthers of one flower to the receptive stigma of the same flower, or more productively to the stigma of another flower, thereby achieving fertilization. So pollination is a very familiar process, but we all realize that it's not trivial. Is that little jolt of possibility when the pollen grain hits the stigma produces a jolt of energy that runs whole ecosystems. It's not just us who are being fed by pollination. It's the whole living world in terrestrial ecosystems. So a flower, once pollinated, becomes fruitful. It produces seeds, which are the promise of more plants. Their food, seeds and fruits are food immediately for insects, for birds, for small animals, which feed other organisms. And so that process of pollination it's the engine of life on terra firma, on Earth. So that jolt of energy from pollination in this age of flowering plants really is what makes the world go round, and was one of the things that E.O. Wilson must have been thinking about. You saw the quote a few minutes ago when he said that insects are the little things that make the world run.
When we come back,
the smallest one is as little as a fruit fly. Lots of them little black ant-like things. The biggest one, of course, would be a nice big fuzzy bumblebee that would half fill your palm. Most of them are quite drab, little brown and black jobs of the insect world, but they're blue and green iridescent bees as well.
get the latest Idealist news, presenter information, and watch streaming video at www.ideacityonline.com.
I don't know if any of you know how many different kinds of bees there are in the world. It seems like a pretty simple mission, go forth and pollinate. But it's a testimony to the amazing variety of flower types and flowering seasons and the complexity of terrestrial ecosystems that the Earth has created 17,000 known living species of bees. So right now, out there in the world, 17,000. And the taxonomists tell us that once the last bee has been pinned and the last strand of DNA has been investigated, we'll have 20,000 at least species identified. So even these very familiar organisms, we still don't have names for all of them. There's still a lot of unknown world out there. 17,000. So the smallest one is as little as a fruit fly. Lots of them little black ant-like things. The biggest one, of course, would be a nice big fuzzy bumblebee that would half fill your palm. Most of them are quite drab, little brown and black jobs of the insect world, but they're blue and green iridescent bees as well. Mason bees, carpenter bees, leafcutter bees, sweat bees, a whole variety of different kinds and lifeways of bees. In North America, there are about 4,000 species of native bees. Most of them, where you will find them mostly, apart from flowers, you're going to find them mostly in places where you don't expect to find bees at all. Because most bees, almost all of those 4,000 species, at least 96% of them, are reclusive and solitary. They don't nest in hives or colonies. They nest inside plant stems or in rotten wood or in a hole in your deck, or most often they nest in little holes in the ground where they lay eggs and provision them and leave their young to reproduce. So you're going to find them mostly in the places that you would never expect to go looking for bees. The median along a parking lot, untended ditches in an industrial area of a city, much more productive for bees than a well-tended lawn, of course. Around headstones, in a graveyard, in any kind of place where we don't create an awful lot of disturbance. And where you're not going to find those bees, tragically, are in the vast, plowed up, sprayed over monocultures where most of our food is grown. What you're going to find there instead are increasingly are colonies of one species, the western honeybee. Honeybees are not native to North America. They originated in Africa and Western Europe, and they were first introduced here in the 1600s, so they came with the European settlers. And they were brought here primarily in the first instance for honey production, because the western honeybee is the champion honey producer of all the 9 species of honeybees in the world. And in the early days and stages of agriculture, which goes back many, many hundreds of years before the European settlers arrived in North America, it was those 4,000 native species that provided pollination for crops and gardens. But as we have pushed back, erased the habitat for wild bees, we've come to rely much more heavily on honeybees for pollination services. So now, rather than honey production, pollination services are a main service of beekeepers. So I'm sure you've read that at least 90 fruit and vegetable crops now rely on honeybees as their primary pollinators. And so you can start with almonds and apples and move right through the edible vocabulary to zucchinis. So about a third of our diet, the most nutritious third of our diet, comes to us courtesy of the efforts of the western honeybee. Now, I have nothing against honeybees. They are, sacred bees, just little atoms of wonder. And I don't know how much you know about them, but you may know that honeybees are models for the study of brain function. They're models for the study of genetic plasticity, the kind of turning on and off of genes that we were hearing about a little while ago. An individual honeybee is immensely sensitive to the world around her. She comes equipped with a very intricate and detailed set of genetic programs so that she can do what's appropriate. She's really a wonderful little organism. And you may also know that honeybees are capable of symbolic communication. When a honeybee who has found a really rich resource comes back to the hive, she won't just go and deliver whatever she's brought, food or water, nectar, pollen. She'll stop and do a little symbolic dance, which goes something like this. She'll land and she'll do her little wiggle like that and walk around and do another little wiggle like this. And the length of her waggle gives the other bees who are following a measurement of how far it is to the resource, and the orientation gives the other bees a read on the angle in relation to the sun in which they must fly. Honeybees use this ability also not just to find food, but also when their community is relocating. When a honeybee colony is actually a composite organism, a queen bee who lays eggs and all the workers who rear the young, together they're a reproductive unit. The drones only have one interest in life and not really part of the functioning of the community except for reproduction. So when the honeybee colony produces a new young queen, about a half or 2/3 of the colony will take off and go and hang in a big cluster somewhere with the queen in the center.
When we come back,
once the decision has been made, the scout bees go through the cluster, bumping into bees, waking them up, time to go, and then all as a group, they fly off and go directly to this new home that collectively they've chosen.
Get the latest Idea City news instantly. Follow us on Twitter.
The Honeybee Dance was first discovered by a man named Carl von Frisch, who won a Nobel Prize in 1973 for that discovery. The use of the dance by bees who are relocating was discovered by one of his students, Martin Lindauer, also working in Germany in the 1940s. And what Lindauer observed was that there are about 5% of the colony of bees that are performing dances on the surface of that hanging cluster of bees. And what they're directing the other bees to, or to the scout population, that 5%, are not flowers this time, but crevices, holes, places in attics, spaces, hollow trees, spaces where the bee colony might move. So an individual bee will go, you'll have to take my word for this, but it is true that she'll walk around inside the cavity, get an assessment of its qualities, come back, perform her dance, which in its intensity and duration gives the other bees some read, perhaps, of how much she liked it. At least the longer she does it, the more bees will be attracted to go out themselves, following her instructions, assess the place, come back based on their own assessment, do their own dance, direct more bees out to have a look, and eventually those 5% of the bees, the scouts, they'll all be dancing for the same place because they'll all have been to these places, and yes, this is the place that we should go. And then once the decision has been made, the scout bees go through the cluster, bumping into bees, waking them up, time to go, and then all as a group, they fly off and go directly to this new home that collectively they've chosen. The people who have been studying this, Tom Seeley at Cornell, chief amongst them, have determined that the bees sometimes can't reach a decision, but they never make a bad decision. Their collective decision-making is infallible. If only that were true of us. And if only we were as focused on the common good as a bee is. But if we needed evidence that our own collective decision-making is sometimes unsatisfactory, we wouldn't have to look any farther than our tacit decision to rely on one species to provide pollination services for our own food production. And as Moses mentioned a few minutes ago, in 2006, a great frisson went through the world, really, when it was discovered that bee colonies had simply disappeared. Beekeeper in Florida went out to check his hives, and no one was home. Everyone had vanished, and why was this? So I am pleased to be able to tell you that colony collapse disorder did not reappear in the United States last year, and that particular syndrome has never appeared in Canada. However, overwinter losses of bees in both Canada and the United States for at least the last 3 years have been more than twice the long-term average. In Ontario, in the last year for which we have statistics, 2007, 2008, that winter, 33% of commercially managed bee colonies did not make it through the winter, compared to the long-term average of about 12%. I think when the researchers started investigating this problem, they wanted there to be a one-stop shop. Here's the problem, we got a new bug, here's a new drug, everything is fixed. But what they're discovering is that the problems are multiple. There are parasites, there is drug resistance to the drugs that have been used to treat those parasites, there's new diseases being introduced, there's the prospect of poor nutrition because of the simplification of ecosystems and the lack of flowers, and so on and on it goes. Now, the good news is, of course, that there are many things that we can do, can remove toxins from our environment. Many things we can do to restore the health of honeybees, but we also need to be really thinking about the well-being of those 4,000 other species of wild bees who are out there right now, bright and beautiful, great and small, just providing pollination services for free. We don't know very much about the status of wild pollinators in North America. The Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation has 58 species already on its red list. It's every reason to think that others, especially specialists, will also be needing attention. What bees ask of us is really simple. They need a world free from poisons. Herbicides are bad for bees because they kill flowering plants. Insecticides are bad for bees because they're insects. They need a world free from poisons. They need safe places, untidy gardens where they can nest. And they need a sweet, summer-long supply of flowering plants. And if we're able to do those things for us, or as we do those things for them, they offer us their greatest lesson yet. For just as a honeybee is a member of her community, we are members of the living community of Earth. The wild lies all around us, and we take it in like breath. Our lives are indivisible from the lives of insects. Thank you. Well, they're pretty important, and beyond that, they're just, well, they're amazing. One of the things that really interested me in doing the research, too, was to know how contemporary the interest in bees is. The people who are studying genetic regulation, people who are studying brain function, people who are doing robotics, they're all looking at bees.